Neil, I wish you came bearing better news for us, but you call this heading towards a tragic denouement in this story. So is it inevitable, and what do you think will happen in the weeks and months to come?
Well, although it's impossible not to be moved by the Ukrainian people's fight to preserve their independence, and it would take a heart of stone not to be moved by some of the stories that have come out of Ukraine in recent days, the reality is that Russia has a pretty massive military advantage in this war and is highly likely to surround Kyiv in the next 3 or 4 days. And I think to overwhelm Ukraine's defenses. That's just a harsh, but I think frank assessment of the military situation. Ukraine is outgunned, it's outmanned, and we have not supplied them with sufficient hardware to deter, much less to repel the invading force. So what happens next, I fear, is an escalation of the bombardment of major cities. Kharkiv has already been taking a pounding. Kyiv too. Kherson fell earlier today, it would appear. And if one just takes a look at the map, there seems every likelihood that Russia will be able to defeat Ukraine's defending forces within a matter of weeks. And that then creates a very grim prospect, because I don't think Ukrainians will just surrender and lay down their weapons. I think they will be fighting a resistance war and insurgency against the invaders. But that will mean more death and destruction. As someone who's been going every year to Kiev for the last 10 years, it breaks my heart to see this country, which saw a future for itself in the West, a future for itself in the European Union or in NATO, to see this country suddenly attacked in this way, to see civilians bombed from the skies in this ruthless fashion. It's agonizing.
If that democratic future is suppressed or is seen as a failure, and largely, as you say, because the US and Western allies haven't provided adequate support leading up to this point, what does that sort of suggest? What implications does that have for the foreign policy ambitions the United States has in Asia, for example? Does it lose credibility elsewhere?
Well, it already suffered a credibility loss in surrendering Afghanistan to the Taliban last year. The United States has failed entirely to deter Vladimir Putin with the threat of sanctions, and is now looking at the biggest war in Europe since 1945. And it doesn't stop there, because first of all, you have the US racing to try to resurrect Iran's nuclear deal, making all kinds of concessions to the Iranians in the process, in the desperate hope that Iranian oil might bring down the price of oil worldwide. But the most important thing from an Australian vantage point, and indeed from a global vantage point, is what this implies for China and Taiwan. The Chinese clearly gave Putin a green light to go ahead, as long as he waited till the Beijing Olympics were over. They clearly are going to support, and certainly not to sanction, Russia. And of course, they're looking at Taiwan and asking themselves, if he can get away with this and face only sanctions, then presumably we can get away with taking control of Taiwan. And that is an issue that I think could come up as early as next year, after the Communist Party Congress concludes towards the end of this year.
Well, that is a real immediate threat that you're talking about. What are some of the risks that China would face, and some of the advantages and opportunities that it sees in the next year to actually carry out what you potentially see happening to Taiwan?
Well, clearly, China's armed forces are much less battle-hardened than Russia's, because China has not really been involved in a war, whereas this is the fourth war that the Russian army has fought since 2008. An amphibious landing is a very difficult operation, of course, and so if China were to try to launch an invasion of Taiwan, it would be taking untested armed forces to do something very difficult. On the other hand, I doubt very much that there would be the kind of resistance that we're seeing in Ukraine today. More importantly, it would be much harder for the United States to sanction China in the way that it is imposing sanctions along with the Europeans on Russia, because the cost to the United States of an economic war with China would be much, much higher given the continuing interconnection of the two largest economies in the world. So I think if the United States couldn't deter Russia with the threat of sanctions, it certainly won't be able to deter China. I also think that China will be looking at the performance of the Biden administration, which frankly has been woeful, and saying to itself, we should take advantage of this extraordinarily weak administration. It may not be in power for much longer.
But Beijing has tried to portray itself as an upholder of the post-World War II international political order. So why would it go against what it's really trying to show itself as a leader, even at the United Nations, at global organizations, at meetings? Why would they go against all of this?
Well, you have to look at the language that was used in the recent joint Chinese-Russian declaration. They have a relationship of friendship, to use the language of that document. China is not going to join in sanctions. It is not going to vote in favor of any UN Security Council resolutions condemning Russia's aggression. In my view, Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, gave Vladimir Putin a green light to do this. And I also expect that Russia will find at least some relief from Western sanctions from China. Chinese diplomats have been, I think, talking in ambiguous ways in order, as they have in the past, to sow confusion as to their true intentions. But judge them by their actions, I think, not by their words. I'm waiting for some Chinese response that meaningfully condemns Russia for its action, but it's not coming.
Okay, so the foreign minister in China speaking to his Ukrainian counterpart saying that China is extremely concerned, that's not enough.
No, it's not enough, especially if there are going to be no economic sanctions imposed by China, and especially if it turns out that China is going to offer Russia economic support to withstand the impact of the Western sanctions. And that is the thing that we need to look for. Otherwise, these are empty words.
Where does this leave global institutions, Neil? The effectiveness, I guess, as we see, this kind of action, this kind of incursion and invasion happen essentially with a response of helplessness and inefficacy.
Well, anybody who watched the proceedings of the United Nations Security Council last week will have been incredulous because, farcically, Russia was in the chair of the UN Security Council, which meant that there could not really be any meaningful UN action because Russia wields a veto, and indeed China will reinforce that veto. So international institutions are, in that sense, in a parlous state. The more encouraging news is that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which of course Ukraine wanted to join, has, I think, shown significant signs of strength in its response to the Russian invasion. So much so that there are countries such as Finland and Sweden even thinking of joining NATO, which would be a major reverse from a Russian point of view. But NATO cannot really help Ukraine directly. It can only help indirectly by supplying weapons to the Ukrainians. And as I said earlier on, I think it's too little too late really to avert the outcome of this invasion. The strength of NATO, I think, in some ways has been reinforced. And perhaps the most significant thing here has been the change of tone in Berlin. The German government really has shifted its position towards Russia and shifted its position on defense spending in ways that I think Vladimir Putin probably didn't expect.